It's not uncommon for people to come into therapy and think that they don't want to talk about their past. They just want to focus on what's going on right now and wherever they want to get to in the future. And in all honesty, sometimes this really does work. But if you're stuck in therapy and you feel like you're not getting anywhere, you really might have to dig into your past. Maybe to some of the things that have happened to you and even into some of the trauma that you've been through so that you can really start making the progress that you want. Stay tuned, and we're going to talk through in this episode some of the importance of talking about your past and working through your trauma so that you can make real progress in therapy.
Any stories shared in this podcast have had names and details changed for the confidentiality of clients. Any resemblance to someone real is coincidental. Hello everybody, thank you for joining us for today's episode. Today we are going to talk about why therapy doesn't work if you're not talking about your trauma or dealing with your trauma. I think trauma is one of those words that is very common now, and people kind of fall on one of two sides. I feel like I see, at least in practice, where they show up and they're like, oh yeah, I have no trauma. No, like I'm good. I want to work on these other things, but it's not trauma. Or I get people who come in and like everything was trauma.
There's lots and lots of it.
Yeah, and maybe we can start by even explaining what trauma is. Like, if you're going to define it clinically, what makes something trauma versus not?
I think this is a really, really good question, and I think depending on what source you look to, you're going to get such different answers about this. You know, I think when I first learned about trauma, the explanation that I heard that felt like it made a lot of sense was it is something that happens, and then after that, your life is never the same. Which I think is a good explanation of trauma. But I also think that sometimes that gets us thinking about like these single event kind of traumas, right? I got in this car accident, and after the car accident, things were never the same. But that's not necessarily like a whole picture of exactly what trauma is. As therapists, when we start talking about trauma, sometimes we even start talking about things that set your nervous system into fight or flight or freeze and kept you in sort of this negative response somewhere within your body for a significant period of time to the point that it affected you over the long haul.
Yeah, I think I always at least define it in my head as you almost can only define it after the fact, right? In the moment, you don't know if something's traumatic necessarily. What makes it traumatic is how it affects you later on, if and how. Because the three of us could all go through the same experience, and it might only be traumatic for me, based on my response to it and how it shows up afterwards. But yeah, it's definitely not a single event thing all the time. I think especially, I've worked with multiple first responders, military people in the past, and one guy specifically, we were talking and his experience, and he couldn't pinpoint like a specific, oh, this horrible thing happened and this was like my PTSD from my time in these fields, but very much had PTSD symptoms. And the trauma wasn't from a single event, but it was from the feeling 10 out of 10 anxious for 10 years of your life, you know?
Right.
And that can be traumatizing. Even though it wasn't one specific moment, it was a kind of a drawn out thing. But again, it's like you can never say what it is until after it's happened and how you respond to it. That's how I think of it.
Yeah, well, and I think too, you know, and this is where it kind of gets into splitting hairs because people are like, well, is that trauma? Is that not trauma? So let's take a child who lived in a home where they were really, really frequently invalidated with their emotions. In it happening one time, is that traumatic? No, that's like just life, right? All of us get invalidated at times. What if that was a pattern, something that happened to you day after day after day, year after year after year, and that was the response that you got more often than not? At what point does that become a like trauma or traumatic situation? Because, you know, as a therapist, I would argue that at some point your nervous system has had specific responses to that so many times that regardless of whether it was this big, huge event or not, you are still likely to have different trauma responses that happen within your body.
So what do we do with this, right? The whole point, okay, so there's our definitions of trauma, and now the question becomes, why is it so important to address it in therapy?
Yeah, and I think that, and I don't even know that we even have to call it trauma, but I can't tell you how many times I have people come in my office and they say, I don't want to talk about my childhood. I don't want to talk about things that have happened to me. I just want to figure out how to move forward from here. And the reality is sometimes you can do that. Sometimes people can come into therapy and can focus on present and future and move forward. But this video, we're really talking about people who are feeling stuck in therapy. And this is one of the reasons that you can feel stuck, because these responses that are happening in your brain and your body were created in the past, and you're carrying them with you into the present, and it's making it so that you can't move forward. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It makes all the sense.
I've had so many people come in and be like, I think trying to avoid this therapy stereotype, and I don't want to talk about my mom, I don't want to talk about my dad, my childhood is good, let's start here. When the reality is, we all have had experiences that in the past, from childhood, from teenage years, that have shaped the way we view the world, and sometimes not for the better.
Right. So I would say that, if you think that this might be you, maybe you're in therapy and maybe you're feeling stuck and you haven't actually explored any of the past, maybe you really do need to go there. And I know that that's not always pleasant, but it doesn't even have to necessarily be about trauma. It just has to be about how your past and your past experiences have shaped the way that you see things now. Because without addressing that, you're really trying to cut off whoever you were in the past and just become this new version of you. That doesn't always actually work.
Well, it's hard.
Right.
It's hard to go. Think about New Year's resolutioners, of which I am one. Right? All of a sudden,
I quit doing those many years ago.
all of a sudden you go from, on New Year's Eve, I'm eating the traditional pizza. Everybody has pizza and mozzarella sticks and little smokies and crackers.
When I was a delivery driver, I made bank on New Year's Eve.
Yeah. And then the next day I go to 2 protein shakes with water, 3 salads, and that's all I eat. You're going to feel like trash, right? The point is not about New Year's resolutioners, of which I am one, but the point is trying to go from who you've been for however old you are, right? 25 years, 30 years, whatever. And then all of a sudden you're going to be someone different without exploring why you've learned the values and principles that you have. It's really hard to do that. And so, you got to sometimes sit back and go through that.
Yeah, and Sharon mentions it's unpleasant sometimes. And I am a big believer in, if you want anything of this much value, it's got to be this much unpleasant. And you can go in therapy and it can be a very comfortable experience, but I don't think that you find a whole lot of benefit or change by staying in comfortable areas, and that good therapy involves being a place where you've learned to feel safe being really uncomfortable or dealing with things that are really unpleasant, so you don't have to deal with it outside of here.
Right. Well, and one thing I might add to this too is that to survive trauma, your body has to come up with different defense mechanisms, right? So let's say that you come into therapy and you say to me, hey, look, Shara, I don't want to talk about any of the past stuff. I just want to have better relationships in the present. But your trauma in the past has been a lot of people breaking your trust, right? Doing things to make it feel like you can't trust others. And so your survival response becomes, I push people away. That's how I survive. And now you're in therapy and you're saying, oh, I want to stop doing that. Well, we're talking about overriding your body's survival mechanism, but you don't want to actually address where that survival mechanism came from. You just want to skip past it. That doesn't really work because your body's survival mechanism is going to override that every time. You can have the idea that you want to go out and have a good relationship, but without addressing some of the past hurt, it's really unlikely you'll be able to move on. I've had multiple people come in with the idea that we were just going to work from the present and forward, and then they found as they get into it that we just keep circling back to oh, well, it comes from here. It comes from here. And the avoidance of trying to avoid trauma, avoid thoughts of trauma, right? That alone is problematic. That is how we get to the point of a PTSD response.
I just want to throw out there the caveat too, in the event that this sounds like we're telling people to just jump in 2 feet cannonball style. As therapists, we recognize that this takes some time too. So even though we're telling you some of the important piece might be that you need to address the trauma rather than avoid the discussion because it's uncomfortable, we're okay with it taking a minute, right? We're patient, hopefully, understanding, or at least we attempt to be. And so even though it feels intimidating, we're aware that that may be the case. It may take a little bit of time.
I always tell my clients that it's like if you want to learn how to do the splits. If I was going to drop into the splits right now all the way,
Can you? That's the more
no,
important
I absolutely
question.
cannot.
I can't either.
But I would really hurt myself if I tried.
Yeah.
But if I wanted to do that, I'd have to like stretch into some uncomfortableness until I made it all the way there. And I think that's very much what this can look like, is just stretch into the uncomfortableness. Don't drop all the way to the splits or you're really going to hurt yourself.
Do you think at my age I could actually get to the splits?
Absolutely.
Do you?
Yeah.
You think enough stretching?
I'm a pretty optimistic guy, though.
Do you think I could? I've never been able to splits in my life.
I don't know. I'd like to see you work on it, though.
No, I don't want to work on it.
Well,
Anyway.
follow up with us next year, and we'll see if Josh can do the splits. It's his New Year's resolution starting October 1st, 2024. Thank you for joining us for this episode. Hopefully something was helpful. Please seek help if you feel like trauma is something you have dealt with. Seek it from a professional. We understand it can be scary, but there is a process to it, and it can be really helpful to get you unstuck from therapy. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thanks.
Bye.
If you enjoyed today's video, please like and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. We've got other videos for you to check out and more exciting things coming soon, so thank you.